now. And I'll kick things off. All right, welcome everyone to today's book launch. I am Dr. Rachel Keekly. I use she, they pronouns, and I am the chair of the Hate Crime Network. And I'm also delighted to be chairing today's book launch session. So today we're going to be discussing two fantastic volumes within a series on hate crime perpetrators, new perspectives from theory, research, and practice. I am delighted to be joined today by the co-editors of this series, so Professor Jon Garland, Dr. Irene Zempi, and Dr. Joe Smith. Jon is Professor of Criminology at the University of Surrey, Irene is Associate Professor at Nottingham Trent University, and Joe is Senior Lecturer and Researcher at the University of Brighton. I hope I have all your titles correct there. Please feel free to correct me if they are wrong. But the volumes themselves cover a wide range of actually what I think are fantastic and really important themes when we're thinking about hate crime. We often focus a lot on victimization and lived experience, which is extremely important. But I think actually focusing on the element of hate crime perpetration as well gives us just a different and quite interesting perspective when we're looking at tackling hate crime. So I am going to hand over to the editors in a moment, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of the way that the session is going to work today. So we're going to start with a quick presentation from, I think Irene is going to lead that, on the books and the edited collections. You can have a little bit more knowledge about what these books involve. I'm then going to ask just a few questions to dig out some of the further themes that the book covers before we then open it up for the last portion of the session onto an audience Q&A. So throughout the session, please do pop your questions in the chat and or at the end, put up your physical and or virtual hand and we will come to you then as well. But without further ado, thank you, Jon, Irene and Joe for being here. I will hand over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. Just to add that my pronouns are she, her. Thank you. As you mentioned, we will provide a brief overview of what the collection covers, and then we are happy to take questions from you, but also the audience here. So this edited collection explores current research into hate crime perpetration, develops theoretical perspectives, and provides scholarly analysis of legal frameworks, policy responses, as well as criminal justice practice. There are two volumes to the collection, and together both volumes argue that difference in all its forms can be targeted by abuse across and beyond as well. The recognized 5 strands of hate crime law and policy in England and Wales, which is race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender identity, alongside behaviors that underpin intolerance, such as scapegoating, stereotyping, and microaggression. So these two volumes bring together a range of perspectives to provide the readers, whether it's students, academics, researchers, policymakers, practitioners, but also the general public, with a comprehensive understanding of the topic. There are two key themes to the collection. The first one is understanding offender profiles and motivations, as well as developing responses to hate both online and offline. And we know that the two worlds are connected. So often, abuse, harassment, and intimidation that starts online then manifests into the offline space, and vice versa. So the two worlds are connected. So in that context, the two themes highlight the links between different forms and arenas of hate crime offending and provide new perspectives on the nature of contemporary hate and intolerance, how it can be understood using appropriate theories, but also how it can be effectively tackled and addressed. In the next few slides, Jon and I will provide you with like a snapshot of some of the chapters. So I will cover volume 1 and then Jon will take over for volume 2. Unfortunately, we can't go through all the chapters today because of limitations in terms of time, but we'll pick maybe 1 or 2 chapters from each volume to give you an insight in terms of what the authors are arguing for as part of this collection. So, for example, chapter 2 by Professor Imran Awan examines Islamophobic hate crime through the lens of hate speech. In the chapter, Who are the Perpetrators of Online Hate? A case study of Islamophobia. So in this chapter, Professor Awan argues that social media remains still an unregulated platform, and identifies that those who are committing hate crimes in the cyberspace have been overlooked by policymakers, but also academics and wider stakeholders. Professor Imran Awan argues that a new, not only national, but international cyber hate crime strategy should be adopted, which highlights the manner in which online abuse occurs and identifies ways in which authorities can deal with these instances more effectively through cooperating together rather than working in isolation, and social media companies getting away with it with no real repercussions of their inaction and inability to protect users, but also identify the perpetrators. Another example of the chapters I wanted to share include the female hate crime offenders, the theoretical and policy implications of an under-researched phenomenon by Brendan Lance, excuse me, and Alexis Faulkner. The author assessed the extent of female hate crime perpetration. This is even more under research in terms of the gender dimension of hate crime perpetration. And they explain how this is different to when perpetrated by males. This chapter also discusses the significance excuse me, of examining these issues by an intersectional framework as a mechanism for doing difference across multiple social domains. As I said, we can't cover all chapters. We just want to give you a flavor of some of the chapters and the topics that are covered throughout the volumes. I don't know if Jon if you wanted to take over for volume 2 or.
Yeah, sure. Yes. Yeah, no, thank you, Irene. Hello, everybody. Yeah, similarly, I'll just highlight a couple of things. I mean, there's, we're very grateful for the contributions for everybody really to the book. It was, very pleased with sort of how it turned out. Probably the one I'll pick out here, I mean, Amanda Haynes's one, I found very interesting, partly because it was just a reminder of the importance when we're looking at perpetration, and also, of course, what we do about hate crime, of institutional issues. In a way, I also found it quite a depressing read because, I was an early career researcher when the Macpherson report came out in 1999, as you all know, I'm sure, spoke about institutional racism in the Met. And here we are all those years later, and Amanda is reminding us of the importance of those issues. She also talks about, some ways to combat them, or at least some initiatives that can help in these situations, things like restorative justice, transformative justice, and the importance of transparency and accountability as well in the criminal justice system when dealing with hate crime. So, very useful, I thought, contribution from Amanda, but in some ways quite a depressing one as well. Esley's one I also found very interesting. Not that I didn't find yours very interesting, Rachel, either. Magnificent chapter. But Esley's one was also really interesting because the online world, of course, is so important in the context of hate crime, trying to understand natures of victimization and perpetration and things like that. And Esley talks about also the importance of understanding the different platforms and how the different platforms work and are regulated, and how they sort of work and interact with the sort of personal use of, the person that's perpetrating hate, how that might be all enabled by the way that these platforms are regulated or are not regulated, how they're driven by profit and things like that. So I found that one, particularly instructive as well. And also, another one I found fascinating was the idea of what happens when you leave a far right group, when you leave an extremist group. What happens then? How does that process actually happen? How does the person go about doing it? So I found Tiana's and Ryan's chapter really instructive on that, the processes by which, through sort of self-reflection, somebody might leave a hate group. But then what happens if they, as they call it, relapse when they go back, and how can we use people who leave extreme groups as well, in terms of research and other educational initiatives. So, the whole far right world, of course, is important to what we're doing. But the pathways out, I think, are really fascinating as well. So I found that one really interesting and useful. Mark's one at the bottom as well, from the National Holocaust Museum. And Mark talking about sort of educational initiatives that you can use drawing upon the Holocaust to try and educate those that perpetrate hate crime in contemporary times, and what they can do to challenge sort of prejudice and what might cause people to enact hate crime, and what we can learn from the past through that. And we also thought we ought to just highlight that we dedicated the book to Sylvia Lancaster. Now, I know that some of you on the call, well, probably most of you, would have met Sylvia or heard her talk. I first met Sylvia, I think it was a year after Sophie was killed, in Manchester Piccadilly train station, when I was just talking to her about what had happened. And it was so moving. But she was also talking about, setting up the foundation and what she was hoping to achieve, and all those years later, when we think about what the foundation has achieved and what an inspiration Sylvia has been, I think probably to us all, and in showing, what you can do, the grassroots organisation to challenge prejudice and hate, in all its forms, to campaign on single issues as well, and what a sort of shining light Sylvia was. So I think all three of us were, proud to have, to dedicate the book to Sylvia and her memory and her work as well.
So that's an overview of the book. Again, I apologize for not being able to cover all chapters, but because of time restrictions, it hasn't been possible. Jo, I don't know if you wanted to add anything we've missed from the outline. No, that's okay. I just thought to ask just in case.
No, I'm going to talk about them a bit, so later.
I also wanted to highlight that we have the conference, the basic conference taking place in July 2026 this summer at NTU. Abstracts are open, so we would welcome your submissions in due course. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I'll put my email in the chat, but I don't want to take the time to talk about the conference, but just to take advantage of an opportunity to promote the conference. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irene. And there's always space to promote the conference as well. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of you for a summary of what are two fantastic volumes. And I say that despite having a chapter in the book, they are excellent anyway. And I think for me as well, I know that I was speaking to Jo at the beginning, it's been a long labour of love, if you can call it love, putting these books together. And I'm always struck by the fact that when I started my career in choosing to research hate crime, I was really hopeful that things were getting better. And I very much feel like they are not to put a depressive tone on things, but I think that shows just how important research like this is. So if I may, I'm just going to ask a few questions to touch on some of the themes that the book covers, so that people have a bit of a flavour and an idea of the sorts of areas that this book is looking at, and then we can open it up to an audience Q&A as well. But just to start with, when we're thinking about the hate crime literature that exists, you're certainly trying to fill a gap here within these two edited collections and these volumes. But I wondered at the time, or even now, you can speak to both, why was it important to centre the offender or perpetrator when you were thinking about putting these volumes together.
Thank you, Rachel. I think we will try to lead each question, then we'll also contribute as well. So I'll start with that question, if that's okay, and then Jon and Jo can also add to it. So as you alluded to the introduction, hate crime has been researched a lot in terms of hate crime victims, but not perpetrators. So there is definitely a gap in the literature, and we've seen that over the last 25 years. Although research has increased significantly, we have a lot of examples of innovative research taking place in terms of the nature, the frequency, the impacts of hate crime victimization, the effectiveness of police and criminal justice responses, but the focus is on victimization. We do have some research on extreme right and related political movements that reflects more on hate crime perpetration, but I think it's still under research. And although most of the research focuses on the experiences of victims, we are not trying to downplay the significance of this. For good and understandable reasons, we are focusing on victims. However, in order to tackle hate crime, we also need to look at the profiles of perpetrators. Who are they? What histories do they have? What motivates? Motivation is so important. What motivates their actions? Otherwise, we can't tackle the problem appropriately, and the emphasis and the pressure is upon victims, to report, to share their experiences, and so forth. But that also means that we're not doing any meaningful work with perpetrators. And unfortunately, we live in a society, both in the UK and globally, where we see that there's a climate of intolerance that is becoming more and more normalized across, all aspects of identities, whether it's the 5 nationally recorded strands, but also the locally recorded strands. So this is quite worrying. We seem to go backwards rather than forward in terms of protecting vulnerable communities, but also working with perpetrators to understand their profile and their motivations. So we feel that this book, which showcases the work of leading scholars researching hate crime perpetration, is so timely. So the book, as we explored in the outline, covers theoretical perspectives, current research into hate crime perpetration, also the analysis of legal frameworks, policy and criminal justice responses, both in terms of policy and practice, in terms of how do we combat hate crime, both at individual but also societal level. So we hope that the book adds a fresh dimension to hate studies through the lens of hate crime perpetration that is so much under researched. I don't know if Jon and Jo would like to add anything.
I was just going to build actually a little bit on what Irene said, and sorry, I should say my pronouns are she, they. I'm Dr. Jo Smith. Irene's point, especially about the kind of societal level of prejudice and intolerance and hate that we're seeing, is also, I think, slightly blurring what it means to be a perpetrator. And there are some very clear examples of perpetration of hate. Your kind of violent racist is a very clear example, but we're also seeing a lot more prejudice and intolerance generally. And I think that trying to better understand perpetration is a good way of sort of understanding a little bit more about that kind of normalized acceptability of things which we may not have as hate crimes, we may not call hate crimes, but there is still something in there that is important to understand. So that focus on perpetration, I think, helps us to be thinking from that direction as well.
Yeah, and perhaps I could just add another dimension to it is the methodological one as well. There's somebody in this meeting I won't name who I know had a torrid time trying to research hate crime perpetration, and it's incredibly difficult. And that's, I think, another one of the reasons why it hasn't been looked at as much or anywhere near as much as the victimization angle. It's such a challenging thing to do, research hate crime perpetration. So, yeah, hopefully we can learn, I think, from the methods used by the authors in the two volumes as well, about how we can go about this very, very difficult task.
Yeah, thank you all for those brilliant answers. And I think maybe I want to draw upon something that Joe started to talk about there, which is the idea that I think these chapters do actually complicate the idea of the typical hate crime offender. I wonder, are we moving away from, almost like a typology of hate crime offending towards something more situational or relational, or is it that we can still use one framework to understand hate crime offending?
I don't know who would like to take that question.
So I was distracted by a question in the chat.
I know, Rogers, yeah.
Yeah, if you could repeat it. Is that what was effectively question 2? Yeah, okay, which I think is me anyway. Yeah, apologies for that. I was looking at the chat. There's a really, really good question. And I think, reading through the book, and well, both volumes, I was struck by how complex the issue of hate crime perpetration actually is. And the idea that we, might have a stereotype of who we think a hate crime perpetrator and or offender is so then, I don't know, dashed, I think, by a lot of the research that's gone into the 2 volumes. Whether we're looking at, online manifestations of Islamophobia, stuff that happens around mosques. That was another, the subject of another chapter in the book. The issue of disablist hate crime and how that's perpetrated. Again, another layer of complexity, feels and looks a bit different. There's also a great chapter in the book on incels as well, which is another layer and another complicated thing. So I think overall, I've learned a lot, I think, from being one of the editors on the book, but I also feel as though it's, hate crime perpetration is incredibly complex. And really, pleased though I am with the 2 volumes, they're really just scratching the surface. It is a very, I think, very complicated issue.
I think it also becomes even more complicated when it's coming from within the community as well, which is even more difficult to unpack. But that's just one aspect. Also online, the challenges of identifying perpetrators in the cyberspace. In some cases, there are practical aspects that add to those barriers, but also the methodological challenges that Jon mentioned. Every time we try to do research that focuses on hate crime perpetrators, it's a no, whether it's from the police or CPS, data. So it's always very, very difficult. So there are practical challenges.
I think for me as well, the chapter by Tiana Godet and Ryan Scrivens is a really interesting insight into the research that is being done with desistance, and shows one really interesting route to accessing those who have been involved in hate groups as one line of research. And I love that chapter. I think it's so interesting, and that's one thing I would say in terms of the future of research. I'd love to see more in that area, but of course that's only one kind of very small group of people involved in a very small way. So methodologically, absolutely, it's really difficult to research in this area, to get access to people and then to have them willing to take part in it. So people who've desisted may be one route, but again, there's more.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it speaks to the complexity of hate crime offending, doesn't it? Which is never easy for us trying to tackle it and respond, but still it shows the many different avenues and things that we can look at. So my next question is, if volume 1 helps us to understand perhaps why hate offending happens or occurs, what does volume 2 suggest about how well our current responses are actually addressing hate crime perpetration and the motivation to perpetrate hate?
So I'm going to take this and I'm going to refer to a few chapters that actually Jon has kindly referred to, because I think they help us kind of help answer and understand this. Certainly when I'm kind of thinking about responses to hate, I tend to have a slightly binary, albeit overlapping, category of kind of your legal and your non-legal. And I think I'll kind of go through a little bit about what the book offers us, I think, in terms of understanding some of the problems with the legal approach, but also the potentials of other approaches. And then I'm gonna maybe go off on a little bit of a tangent about the broader context in which we are kind of thinking about hate and how that is affecting responses as well. So when it comes to the more legal approaches to responses, I think Amanda Haynes' chapter particularly is really good for being quite critical of the legal approaches. As Jon's already highlighted, she looks at the institutional level issues, which are essentially creating real issues in providing that legal response. So from the kind of institutional bias within policing and within the courts as well, distrust of the police, hate perpetrated by those within the police, poor evidence gathering, and so on. So certainly Amanda's chapter is very much critical of the legal responses, and as Jon described, that is it feels like quite a downbeat chapter, but I actually took something quite positive from it, which is what she then goes on to talk about, which is how can we look to other approaches to understanding the legal system and the justice system to help us try to reform it and reshape it. And that's where she draws from kind of abolitionist work and from critical scholarship to look at how, if we were to transform the justice system, if we were to think more about transformational justice and community approaches and greater transparency and accountability, actually we could look to improve these responses. So I think that's something which I found quite hopeful. I think that's quite a positive message for how we might see improvement in the response of the legal system. And there's also lots of discussion within the kind of second volume around alternative approaches. And I think these are really, really significant. So a lot of the chapters emphasize things like the importance of education, prevention, community engagement, awareness, and so on. And we've already talked about Tiana Godet and Ryan Scriven's chapter about desistance and leaving hate groups, and that I found particularly interesting in terms of thinking about responses, because it talks a little bit about things like the importance of friends and family and positive, meaningful activities, and those things which are causing people to step away from being members of hate groups or kind of thinking in those particular ways. So I think there's something about that which is quite positive as a response. Rachel, I know your chapter was kind of looking at some of the causes and looked particularly at things like primary socialization and education. And what I took from that in terms of a response perspective is also how we can kind of flip the narrative on it. So if we know and understand that some of the prejudicial attitudes or the intolerances come about through primary socialization, which are then embedded within education when young people end up in schools, what can we do in schools that we could try to undo some of that? So if we know what we're doing and it's not going particularly well, how can we flip it so that actually we're using those spaces to try to draw young people away from some of the intolerances they might have been developing before they got to school? So again, kind of those responses that are outside of just thinking about the legal, but trying to stop things before somebody kind of falls too deeply into problematic attitudes and potentially going on to hate crime. But the chapter I think that is most interesting to me in this and most kind of positive and hopeful is that by Mark, who is at the Holocaust Museum. And he talks about their program Breaking the Cycle, which is a program for those who have been involved in kind of low-level hate as an alternative to going into the justice system, and the ways in which they can use kind of education in order to challenge prejudices. And it's an absolutely great chapter, not least because it's very, very practical in terms of suggesting to the audience how they can also set up a similar program and what they did and that worked, what they did and didn't work. So it's all very kind of nicely reflective of education programs and how those can be developed. So again, I think there's a kind of positivity in those responses, which are the non-legal approaches, and that's what I get a lot from the kind of second volume. And I guess the final point I wanted to make is that all of these responses, be they educational, social, community, legal, whatever they may be, we need to think about broader context. And, you know, Irene and Jon have also already talked a little bit about this, but the broader context in which we are living, the socio-political climate and times in which we are living, will affect the efficacy of responses to perpetration. And I think that is apparent throughout the book. And it feels quite a bit like prejudice and intolerance is now increasingly being woven into the fabric of society. And we see that, you know, for example, in Amanda's discussion of institutional bias within the police, and we see it coming from the top in some of the political rhetoric that we see. And to some extent, I think it's important to think about individual perpetration of hate and to try and understand that, but it's also important not to treat hate crime perpetration as siloed individuals acting sort of in this little discrete box in which they are intolerant and prejudiced and so on. They are part of a broader society that is allowing some of these attitudes to become more mainstreamed and acceptable. And so part of what we need to think about in our responses is, what do we do to push back against some of that as well, and to try and, to use a more political term, how do we kind of shift the Overton window? How do we shift what is acceptable back a little bit away from some of the places I fear that it's gone to? Okay, that was quite lengthy, but that's my response to your responses question, Rachel.
Brilliant. I don't know if Irene or Jon had anything to add there, but I think that was, yeah, fantastic. So thank you for that. I think just one final question for yourselves, and then we'll open it up to the questions. I know that there's some in the chat. And maybe this is a bit of a loaded question, or maybe it's a sort of impossible one, but looking to the future, if you were to design perhaps a research agenda or a focus building on these volumes, what questions do you feel right now are most urgent, or perhaps still quite under-theorised?
Well, I think David has already started to do our job for us by suggesting kind of accidental perpetration. So I think there's something, David's question in the chat, I think points to something that would be quite an interesting area for research. I'd like to see more on Amanda's ideas about transforming the justice system by drawing from kind of abolitionist perspectives and so on. I think that's a really interesting direction of research. As a lawyer, I'm always interested in the law and hate and how the law is dealing with hate crime, hate speech, hate incident, and how that intersects with things like the capacity of the justice system to cope with it, the experiences of those within the justice system, and how perpetrators experience that. But one of the things I think would be really interesting to understand, and it kind of sits a little bit within my previous point, is how are people understanding what hate is and what hate crime perpetration is? There's a huge amount of absolutely superb work out there on victim experiences and understandings of hate. I'm kind of intrigued and interested in what the, use a legal term, the person on the Clapham omnibus thinks hate is about. How do they see perpetration? Because again, I think it's about understanding what the wider societal picture of hate looks like and prejudice and intolerance looks like in order to try to deal with it. And if most people are, if we're looking at something and thinking, well, that looks like hate or a hate crime to us, but most people just see it as free speech, then what does that actually mean for how we respond to that? So I'm kind of interested in what a general public understanding of hate crime law, hate crime perpetration looks like.
John, Irene, do you have anything to add to that?
Do you want to go first, Irene?
No, that's fine. If you go, and then I'll go last.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just reminded, I suppose, Joe, of Muslim Busharians' current research, which is looking at sort of everyday of understandings of how people recognise hate crime or understand it. Obviously, Muslim's sort of well into his research now. And it'd be really interesting to see, when he comes to publish what he finds. But he is looking at, how people perceive an incident, what they read into it, how they perceive sort of prejudicial language, and what for them actually constitutes a hate crime, and what is just, either sort of banter or just rudeness. So, yeah, some interesting stuff going on.
I would like to see a better connection between academics and policymakers and practitioners, because as academics, we need them to give us access to perpetrators, unless I guess they have been released from prison and we try to do it that way, but no one will come forward saying, I've committed a crime, motivate. So they will acknowledge the crime, as we know, but they will refuse to say that, I'm racist, homophobic, transphobic. But that said, I hear more and more people saying, I am racist, so what? Or I am transphobic, so what? So I think for me, the methodological barrier of not having access, whether it's to data or like real people who have been or are in the process of the criminal justice system, is an unknown territory. So I think we need those voices to be captured. Otherwise, again, it's through the lens of victims, which is valuable, but I think we need to move beyond that if we really need to address hate crime perpetration, especially in the current climate, where it's institutional, it is structural as well, and it's becoming more and more normalized.
I suppose another interesting line of inquiry would be to sort of step a bit outside the silo and look at perpetration outside the silo. So, we obviously talk about the idea of there being these kind of siloed strands of hate and the recognized strands of hate, and kind of they don't really cross over, certainly in terms of legal recognition, policy recognition, but actually looking at kind of perpetration that is intersectional perpetration, if that's not a slightly strange word to use in this context, or perpetration for in relation to prejudice and intolerance towards those not recognised within the law. So, alternative subcultures, the homeless and so on. How does that perpetration look as well? And although quite how you access people involved in that is another methodological challenge.
Absolutely. I think if you are misogynistic, you will be transphobic and you will be homophobic as well, right? So it's definitely intersectional.
Brilliant, thank you all. So I wanted to give some time for the questions from the chat. So I am going to stop recording now, but thank you everyone for your contribution so far.